Story 1. My parents, for some weird reason, told me that in Japan they had red, yellow, and green traffic lights that function just like here in the United States. But they also mentioned that there was a blue light which meant to go backwards. Story 2. How my mom broke her knee in 1998. The story was she slipped in a store shopping for Christmas gifts. That was the year we got dirt bikes. The real story is my parents were testing our bikes and she flew off a ramp. I learned the truth 22 years later. I was a smart kid, but not always the brightest. Story 3. My father mentioned in passing, as a joke, I guess, that I was an alien. He gave me this whole backstory about me being found in their yard, so they kept me. I found this story so believable and reassuring. Felt like it explained why I never seemed to fit in with kids at school. I believed it for a year or two until one day, I mentioned it to him, and he couldn't even remember telling me. Story 4. When I was really young, I remember my mom getting a small ceramic pig from somewhere. Me, being young and selfish, asked her, "Where's mine?" She, probably having a bit of a stressful day, answered, "I ate it." That made me believe that the ceramic pig was edible. For the next few months, I would occasionally take it off the shelf where she had placed it and try to take a bit out of it. The fact that it was too hard to bite through didn't deter me. I just figured that I hadn't yet learned the trick as to how to make it edible. Story 5. My mom used to tell me the snacks she bought and didn't want me to eat had onions in them. I always thought to myself, why would anyone want an onion cookie? People are weird. Story 6. My mom told me she didn't have a middle name because her family couldn't afford one. I believed that for years. I asked her about it, and she didn't even remember telling me. Story 7. The ice cream truck only plays music when it has sold out, so kids won't see it and get excited to get ice cream. Brilliant move on my parents' part. I would hear the music and get bummed because it always sold out before it got to my house. Story 8. My dad told me that you were supposed to look through the webbing of the baseball glove while holding it up to your face to catch a pop fly. I think I was in 4th grade when I joined a team, and I still remember the coach's tone of absolute disbelief when he asked what I was doing. Story 9. That meringue was calf slobbers. My dad told me this when I was 4 or 5, and it grossed me out so much I refused to eat any pie with meringue until I was in my 20s. Story 10. When I was about 6, my mom had surgery to remove a lump next to an impacted wisdom tooth. A few years later, she had another lump removed and then another. We were told they were benign tumors that kept coming back. Ultimately, she had so many surgeries that she lost part of her jaw and ears, and her face was covered with bandages. Many years later, after she had died, I was talking to my newly discovered half-sister about our mother's illness. She told me that my stepmother had told her about it and she had cancer, not benign tumors that kept coming back. I actually remembered the name of her oral surgeon and went to see him. He confirmed what my half-sister said and told me he had suggested to my parents more than once they at least tell me, as the oldest, the truth. My mom couldn't do it because as long as she believed they were just benign tumors, she could believe she would get better. In the end, she was hospitalized for a month and then went to a nursing home. My last conversation with her was in the hospital, and she was talking about having plastic surgery to fix her face when they got the last tumor out. Turned my world upside down to learn the truth. Story 11. The P-activated dye in swimming pools. I was in my 30s when I found out this wasn't really a thing. I had just assumed that either people were too cheap to buy it, or no one wanted to advertise just how much pee was in the pool. Story 12. My dad was a police officer and always told me, if you're ever lost or scared, find a policeman and tell him who you are. You can trust them. I was 18 years old, sitting in a car park with a girl. Nothing untoward was happening, not for lack of desire, and a police car turned up. They searched my car and me looking for something, and left. I went home thinking nothing of it. The next day, my dad, fuming, asked what happened as he had been told some paperwork with my name on it was filled in, and the secretary noticed and let him know. I told him everything. It turns out they had recorded me as a drug dealer driving a brand new blue Ford Focus. I drove a black 14-year-old Citroën Saxo and had timestamp pictures not 10 minutes earlier of me and the girl inside the car, posing like morons. The fury he unleashed on his inspector I wish I had witnessed. Needless to say, I've never trusted the police since, and my dad retired not long after. Story 13. I was the only student in my entire middle school graduating class of about 150 who was accepted to go to the gifted high school the following year, but my parents talked me out of it, saying that I wouldn't like it. Instead, I went to the regular metro high school where I was just a number. Another brick in the wall? Apparently, it turns out my mother didn't want the responsibility of taking me to school every day and picking me up since the school buses for Roosevelt High didn't come to my neighborhood, and the school was across town. Because I believed them, I didn't go, which also led me to not going to college. The older I get, the more I wonder how my life would have been different had I spent my high school years in an environment where going on to higher education was a foregone conclusion rather than the unspoken burden I knew my parents thought it was. The thing I believed until it was too late was that it wasn't possible for me to go to college, being one of 4 children in a barely at the bottom of the middle-class single-income family. My mother didn't work. I'll tell you this much. When my youngest was accepted into the North Carolina School of the Arts for his senior year of high school, I moved heaven and earth to make sure he had the opportunity to go, which eventually led to him graduating #1 in his university music program. Story 14. It wasn't exactly a lie, it was just the prevailing belief at the time. My dad told me that glass is a liquid, an extremely viscous liquid, but a liquid nonetheless. I was in maybe 4th grade at the time. When my teacher asked for an example of a solid, liquid, and gas, I mentioned glass as a liquid, and she scolded me. But later that week, the head of the science department stopped me in the hall and told me I was right. And then, 30 years later, I learned that this belief was based on a paper published wherein very old glass windows were measured and found to be thicker at the bottom and thinner at the top, and that meant that the glass was flowing, if extremely slowly. Think extremely slowly. But it turned out that the thicknesses of those windows was due to the old method for making glass being imperfect, and that once cooled, glass stopped flowing. Story 15. That if you held a shell up to your ear, you could hear the ocean. I think I was in high school when I read that you were actually hearing the air currents swirling around your ear. At first, I didn't believe it, but then I realized that, of course, you didn't really hear the ocean. Story 16. That it was an actual law for children to be in bed by 8 p.m. on weeknights. So even though my mom would love to allow me to stay up later, she couldn't because it's the law. Story 17. My family got our first dog when I was about 4, and another followed shortly after. My mom told me that puppy teeth dissolve instead of falling out. I never questioned it. If I could show you the wait-a-minute face I made when I got my own dog at 18 and found a puppy tooth on my kitchen floor. Story 18. My mom would tell me that older brothers are supposed to torment younger siblings. It's just the way it is. And that no matter how awful they were to me, so awful, someday we'd be the best of friends. As adults in our 50s and 60s, we are not friends. Story 19. A conversation at work shifted from the strangest food you've eaten to the strangest food you've heard of. Balat, kasumarzu, stuff like that was brought up. I mentioned that Mongolian horsebutt cheese, and everyone was kind of taken aback. I explained that there is still a small group of Mongolian nomads that take milk from horses or goats or something, pour it into a bladder, then put it in a horse's rear to make a type of cheese. I assume the motion, heat, it creates some sort of cheese. Nobody believed me, so I went to look it up. Not a thing. I'm sure some adult told me this as a joke when I was like 8 or 9, and I believed it until I was 40 years old, until this last year, just one of those weird facts, I know most Asians, including Mongolians, are lactose intolerant, but I also know they consume a lot of dairy. I know it sounds insane, but I never questioned it. Kind of shook my faith in my core assumptions about the world. I swear I'm not an idiot for the most part. Story 20. My mom told me that if I flipped the light switches on and off really quickly, like to make the lights flash, it would start an electrical fire. She told me that when I was about 4. I believed her until I was almost 22. Story 21. I was told that if I turned the lights on while in the car at night, it's illegal and the police would take me to jail. I was 5 and believed that till I got my license at 18. Story 22. My parents told me that it was disrespectful to people with disabilities to use automatic door openers. I'm sure this was to keep us from playing with them, I avoided them my whole life. When I was 30, I got a job in a hospital where every door had them, and it gave me a one-day crisis to rebuild my morality system. Story 23. Our dad would tell us Chuck E. Cheese was only open for birthday parties when we would ask to go on a random day. My sister almost passed away when her friend at school told her she went over the weekend just because. Story 24. My mom and her family once made up a grand story about how my uncle was working with a chainsaw in his garage, and my cousin walked into the garage, surprising him. The story goes that he turned and lifted the chainsaw, and it went up through her dress, flipping her over. He threw the chainsaw down and somehow thought that he had cut her severely, maybe even thought he had killed her. The whole family rented a giant suite at a hotel nearby, and all of us cousins were put in a different hotel room down the hall. The family was calming him down, supposedly talking to him for many hours. Adults would come into the room to tell us kids that everything is going to be fine and our uncle was just feeling crazy based on what he imagined he had done to his daughter. Many years later, I was talking to the uncle, telling him I remember that day very clearly and always thought about it and never wanted to use a chainsaw because of the story. We were around a bunch of family. He was incredulous at the story. Long story short, it turns out the truth was he had been selling marijuana, and the rest of the family wanted him to turn himself into the police and go to jail. Holy crap. I am so glad he never turned himself in. He argued the entire day with the entire family and never gave in, and his reasoning was the law was stupid and made up. Marijuana helped him and his friends with emotional issues, and he had no intention of ever stopping consuming it. The year was 1981. Story 25. I thought chocolate milk came from brown cows well into middle school. I remember my teacher specifically saying, "It's like believing chocolate milk comes from brown cows," and everyone laughing. I looked around and was like, but that's true. I was so off, laugh out loud. Story 26. You have to wait an hour after eating before you go swimming or you'll get cramps and drown. Going outside in the cold with wet hair will make you catch a cold. Or just that going out in the cold at all will give you a cold. Your hair and fingernails continue to grow after you die. Not me, but my brother-in-law believed that cats were all female and dogs were all male until he was in his early teens. I don't know where he got that from. Story 27. My dad told me the electricity meter was a piggy bank. We'd visit my grandmother each weekend, and she'd give me 10 pence for sweets, but I'd save it and ask my dad to hold me up to the meter so I could put my 10 pence away safely. I got bored of that eventually, being a typical 2 to 3-year-old and realizing instant gratification with sweets and comics was far superior to saving. It only dawned on me in my mid-30s that I'd been contributing to the household utilities. Story 28. My parents told me we got charged more per day for each light switch flick because I like to play with the lights, implying the price increases with each use. Thus, I was very strategic with my light switch use when I first moved out on my own. Story 29. That blood is blue and only turns red once it's exposed to the air. That's why our veins appear blue. I remember arguing with a teacher in the playground because the entire idea seemed ridiculous, but she swore on her children's lives that it was true. Story 30. That if you try your best, that's all that matters. Not true in reality. It works in some situations, but the longer I live, the more I realize it's mostly not true. Story 31. I once asked my dad what the DC in Washington meant. He didn't know, but to placate his curious young child, he said, Democratic Capital. I believed it meant that for years afterwards until I learned what it really meant in school. Story 32. I was in my 30s when a friend pointed out the black sticker with a blue line going across the center and told me it was the bisexual pride flag. I believed this for years. I would speed up to see who was advertising their bisexuality on their car. I could not believe all the people flying their flag. Then, someone told me it was to support the police. I have lost touch with the friend who told me that, so I still don't know if he was trolling me or if he thought it was true. Story 33. My dad told me at the age of 12 that I was a bright pupil. However, as a girl, he wanted me to prepare for the fact that boys would be brighter than me from now on. He really believed it. I proved him wrong. This was 40 years ago. Story 34. That my parents sent my cat to live on a farm. I was talking to my friend about this well into my 30s, and she was saying, oh, yeah, like there's some farm out there where all the pets live. And that's when I figured out what really happened. 25 years was not enough time to cushion the blow of that wound being reopened. Story 35. As a kid, I loved having soy sauce with my rice. It was the only thing I would eat. I guess in order to stop me from having too much, my mom would tell me that the more soy sauce I had, the more moles would develop on my skin. My mom's lie worked, and I believed that until I was in high school.